Everybody's got a story, you just have to listen. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and this is Good Listen. And a lot of us have that person who we could best describe as a lot in their life. Maybe being self-reflective, maybe we're a lot. Maybe we're always seeking too much, wanting to be the best we possibly can. Well, being the best can come with some drawbacks. And my guest today is Lauren Farina-Prieto, and she helps these people who are a lot, or as she calls them, high-performing individuals, adapt and cope with being the best they can be. So we're going to find out how it all started and how we can identify if we're high performers and what we can do to live it in a healthy lifestyle. Lauren, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Joe. I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I want to start by talking about one of your specialties, and that's high performers. And one of the things that always drove me crazy about high performers is they always felt like they were searching for a chip on their shoulder. Like a lot of these high performers are very successful, hence the high performer. But once they get to that point, they didn't need to search out other things that may prevent them from becoming high performers. And so the example I like to use is Tom Brady. I'm a lifelong New York Jets fan, so I suffered through 20 years of Tom Brady beating my team twice a year. But every year, without missing a beat, every time he would win a Super Bowl, and now for folks not familiar, Tom Brady won 7 Super Bowls. Every time after he won, he'd say, "They counted us out. No one thought we had a chance to win. They were talking. No, they said it was going to be impossible to do this." And then inevitably they won every year. And it always drove me crazy. I'm like, who are these people saying that you weren't supposed to win? You're Tom frickin' Brady. And so and Tom Brady's just an example of this, but you see this all the time, whether it's in business, technology, and sports. What is it that drives these high performers to find a chip that doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've never heard it phrased quite like that before, but I think in many cases you're right. So, to your point, my work is really focused on supporting the high performer personality, and what I've learned is that there's sort of this high performer paradox in that sort of the more successful, I would say, by traditional standards, the more that some people tend to struggle and struggle with certain things in particular, like fear, for instance. So in my experience, what I've learned is there's sort of a high performer archetype, and it includes perfectionism. And what we know is that perfectionism is as Brene Brown puts it, fear with designer shoes on, right? And so that's kind of why these high performer personalities develop, is in an effort to defend against perhaps it's fear, perhaps it's shame, perhaps it's failure, perhaps it's some other sort of insecurity. But I think you're right, right? I think high performers are always seeking something, even if it's defending against something that maybe doesn't necessarily exist.
Yeah, and another, I'll use one more football analogy. So I mentioned I'm a Jets fan, and 2 years ago when the Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers, another high performer, inevitably, as a Jets fan knows, something wrong happened. So, within the first 4 plays of the season, Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles. It was a big story, so people know this. But the next morning, he appeared on his friend's TV show. What's his name? McAfee, and he goes on and talks about, hey, I'm going through this, I'm struggling, and then he just jumps in. Now, this is like less than 24 hours after the injury. He goes, "I know people are counting me out and don't think I'm going to come back." And then McAfee goes, "Oh, have you read, like, people on social media say that they're counting?" I was like, "No, but I think they probably are." And it's like, wait a minute. So, I mean, it was the first time I actually saw someone get caught, like, actually creating this chip that I talk about. So it is funny how it's almost like, I don't know, is it a natural thing? Like it's like they don't even have to, like, work on it. Like, it's immediately there. It just snaps into it, doesn't it?
Well, and as a therapist, I always think about childhood, right? I hate to be cliche, but I think sometimes this sense of your phrase, the chip on one's shoulder, having to prove oneself, develops early on in life. And to go with your sports analogy, I was watching the Last Dance documentary with my kids on Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. And what was so fascinating, I mean, the whole documentary is fascinating, but what stood out to me is Michael Jordan talked about how he was always vying for his father's attention, right? That his father actually preferred his older brother because he was more handy and could help him out, outside and help him to fix the car. And Michael Jordan just wasn't as handy, right? He just didn't know his way around a toolbox, and his father would sometimes get frustrated with him, and his father was interviewed and acknowledged that. And so Michael Jordan said, I was always trying to capture my dad's attention, right? I was always trying to make him proud. And so the part of Michael Jordan that developed into a high performer, right? The part that was just never felt it was enough, and rigorously trained over the course of a summer after he didn't make the varsity league in high school. That was the part of him that was seeking out some kind of validation, that suspected that perhaps, at least in his father's eyes, he wasn't good enough. And so this part develops in an effort to defend against that not feeling good enough, or to defend against that insecurity that people were, in Michael Jordan's case, that his dad might have been counting him out. And so it is really paradoxical, right? The part of, in this instance, Michael Jordan, or, in your examples, Tom Brady and other players, the part that thinks people are counting me out is maybe a part that experienced some of that early on in life.
Yeah, and it's funny. One more sports analogy, and I'll borrow the Last Dance one. And you probably remember the scene after he'd won multiple titles. He went out to dinner, and the night before his next finals, I think he was playing the Seattle SuperSonics, and he was out to dinner with a friend, and he saw the head coach of the other team in the same restaurant, but the head coach didn't say hello to him because his head coach was like, he's an extra player. I'm not going to talk to him. He used that motivation of him not saying hello in the restaurant to win another title. And if you think about just the pettiness of it, like most people wouldn't even think twice, but Michael Jordan needed the fact that the opposing coach didn't walk up to him in a restaurant to drive him. And for folks who have not seen this The Last Dance, he's actually said that in words, that that extra motivation of him being ignored at dinner drove him to win another title.
Yeah.
So another great example. But I'm done with sports analogies, Lauren. So I will stop. I'll stop there, Lauren.
Fair
But so
enough.
let's start with this idea of these high performers. As we've stated over the last several minutes, they can be a real pain in the ass because they have this thing that they need to search out for. Why did you get involved in working with high performers?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. I think in general, I've just always been fascinated by the human condition and sort of what makes people tick, and I've loved to just sit and hear people's stories. But a little more than 10 years ago, I landed a great job running the employee assistance program for a large academic health system. And so my responsibilities included developing and implementing programming and policies and services to support the colleagues of the health system in managing their stress and improving their mental health. And so my clients were people like doctors and nurses and executives and scientists, and all people that we would consider to be successful by traditional standards. But what I soon found out is that a lot of these people, what I've come to term as high performers, were really struggling, which surprised me, right? Because I think we're all sort of conditioned to believe that if I am successful, then I will be happy, and if I achieve the heights of status and prestige and income and productivity, then I'll feel fulfilled. And what my clients taught me at the hospital was that's just not always true, right? And often, again, paradoxically, it's the inverse that I was observing, at least, that in some cases, of course not all, but in some cases, the more successful a person was in their career, the more perhaps they suffered mentally, emotionally, or relationally in their in their personal life. So I became so fascinated and intrigued by that paradox that I just became a student of it, and really honed my focus in supporting this high performer personality.
So without psychoanalyzing you, because I dropped out of college, it almost sounds like you were also a high performer and you were looking within as well. Because I don't think I'm making up words here, but I don't think a low performer could work with a high performer because knowing from working with them is they don't put up with that shit. Pardon the friend. So safe to assume that you ought to consider yourself a high performer.
I consider myself a reformed high performer. I think having walked that path myself, and truly, I think struggling with the perfectionism and people pleasing and self doubt that many high performers are plagued with, I do think it's sort of an evolutionary imperative to turn around and want to help others in the same way that you yourself were helped and healed. So yes, you read me right, Joe. I am absolutely a high performer at heart, but I'm working at it.
Good for you. Good for you. You mentioned earlier about a lot of this stuff ingrained in childhood, and that's sort of like a very cliche thing in psychotherapy. But I mean, there was this great line that Scorsese always that said once. He goes basically that the reason cliches are cliches is because they're true. Like more times than not, a cliche is a true thing because it's just known to be true. So is that pretty much like what you've seen your entire career in you working in therapy? Is the fact that a lot of these, whether it's pros or cons of a human, it all started as a child?
I think in large part because we're so neuroplastic as children, right? We're just like sponges, especially between the ages of 0 to 3, but from 0 to 7, and even on up, right? And our personality develops in as an adaptation to the environment in which we grew up, right? And that's how we develop our traits and our behaviors. I think that traditionally we think we're born with our personality or that our personality is somehow genetic, and maybe genes do play a role, but what we now understand is that our personality is a set of, in essence, survival mechanisms, right? That we develop perhaps a sense of humor, or perhaps a high performing personality, or we're really good in sports because we realize that helps us, and that helps us to adapt, and it helps us to secure the praise and attention of the people around us, and therefore helps us to feel safe.
So it's almost like a nature nurture thing as well. But can someone, I guess it's a weird way to say it, but if someone is not a high performer or doesn't have the tendencies or traits, can they become a high performer over time?
That's such a good question, and I totally think that's possible. And I think the key to that is by honing in on one's core values, right? Like really focusing on, okay, what are the things that matter most to me? Because the things that matter most to us tend to energize and invigorate us the most. So what we know is that intrinsic motivation, meaning goals that we set that are reflective of our core values, the things that matter most, is more likely to inspire long term motivation and goal achievement than extrinsic motivation, basically doing things because of external pressures or somebody else told us that we should. So, yes, absolutely. And I would add that in order to become a high performer, we really need to focus in on what matters most, what energizes and invigorates us.
Hmm. Is there cases where maybe someone is, again, I don't even know if this is a phrase, like a low performer, or just someone who's not a high performer that has like either a traumatic experience or life changing experience that will then drive them? Because I'm using the example of, maybe people involved in domestic,
Yeah.
issues, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden, like them fleeing from that situation makes them a high performer. Maybe it was always in there, but people come across a spark in their life that may drive them to become a high performer.
Yeah, absolutely. And in sharing my own experience as a high performer, I think that was true for me too, right? Like the fear and perfectionism and anxiety and self-doubt that I experienced as an adolescent is what sort of precipitated my interest in this work. And so I think in the example that you shared, somebody leaving an abusive situation might also inspire them to number one, develop the skills that are necessary for them to survive that difficult situation. And
Right.
number two, turn around and then perhaps inspire and support others who have been in a similar scenario.
Hmm. One thing I will say, and I guess I consider myself a high performing person, and the only reason I do is because I'm my own toughest critic. Like I've always been. Only recently I've done performance reviews, but my entire career, working in legacy media is like if I was always my toughest critic in terms of review. So like if I did something wrong, I would be harder than my boss would be. So what is it about people like me and the folks that you work with, this ability to just beat the living shit out of themselves? Like, because I've had the situation before where like I remember screwing up early on in my career and I went into my boss and I just literally did like a 5-minute monologue of how I screwed up. And then at the end of it, my boss had nothing to say. They're like, Oh, okay. Like my boss, I feel like was waiting to like criticize me, but after I was done, sort of, so what is that? Flagellating yourself, whatever that phrase is. Like once I was done with that, the boss had nothing to say. So what is it about people like me that just really are just not generous when it comes to giving ourselves grace?
Well, and I think this is quite commonplace among the high performer personality is this tendency to um to self-criticize, right? To be our, as you say, our own worst critic. And I think what's important to understand there is that that part too is an adaptation, right? That all parts, anxiety, self-doubt, self-criticism, are trying to help us. They're sort of like a well-intentioned great aunt, right? Who's just trying to help, but oftentimes just gets in the way, right? Or comes at a cost. And so I would ask you, and I would ask anybody who's really struggling with intense self-doubt and self-criticism, what's that part trying to do for you, right? What is the self-criticism trying to accomplish? Because I promise it's there. It's got this positive intention. And oftentimes what I hear from my clients is, oh, that part is trying to propel me forward, right? It's trying to help me to identify my shortcomings and to remedy them. That part's trying to get ahead, perhaps in your case with your boss that you shared. It's trying to get ahead of anything bad anyone else can say about me. Because if I think it first, then perhaps it won't hurt as much than if they say it to me before I consider
Wow, I feel like I should be laying on a couch or something while I'm talking to you, Lauren.
it.
Because it's true. I mean, that's like you describing the fact of like getting ahead of it is, I think, the best way to do it. Is like it's almost like this rip the band-aid thing. Like if you don't do it, if you don't do it right away, it's just going to linger, and then second guessing and all that stuff just is even worse. I'm sure when it comes to high performance, the second guessing is probably something that comes pretty naturally to us.
Absolutely, and in the sports examples that you shared earlier, right? Everybody counted us out is what Brady said, right? Second guessing what he imagined everybody was thinking about him is what compelled action and sort of ambition. And in the Last Dance example, right? Feeling slighted is what precipitated Michael Jordan's motivation in that instance. And so, yes, I think it's so important because when we sit down and address the self-doubt, the self-criticism, the anxiety, the perfectionism, I think traditionally we think, "Oh, we gotta get rid of it." That's not helpful, Joe. You gotta stop doing that. But we're missing a step. We're not considering, well, why are you doing that in the first place? How is that part helping you? Because I promise you it is. Perhaps it comes at a cost, but it's trying to help in some way.
Hmm. There's a word you used a couple times during this conversation. It's anxiety, and I
Mhm.
feel like in this world, if you use enough, if you use it enough, it will lose its impact.
Mm.
An example of this is woke. I think when the word woke came out,
Yeah.
it was aware of injustices, like aware that people have had shitty histories. So that was where woke started, and then we don't need to go into the whole political discourse of it, but it got beaten to death where it actually meant something else and the actual meaning of it meant nothing.
Totally.
And I think anxiety falls into that bucket as well. People throw that word around, and I'm sure as a therapist might upset you more than it does me, but like throw it around as if they've self-diagnosed themselves like, oh man, I've got this anxiety from this test, or I've got this anxiety from this date, or what have you. What is it about the use of these words like anxiety when you don't really know if you're using it correctly?
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I also think narcissism is another one, really, that we overuse without really understanding the context. But Joe, I'll say I think there's a difference between anxiety as, say, a symptom or an experience. I was really anxious before the test. Maybe my heart was racing, or I was short of breath, or whatever. But there's a difference between anxiety as a symptom or an experience, and anxiety as a clinical diagnosis. Right? Those are 2 very different things. And I think, in the world of social media and podcasting, we have access to all of this information that wasn't historically at our fingertips maybe 15 or 20 years ago and now is. And so I think that there are a lot of perhaps lay people who are self-educating, right, via these media, and I think that's really important, but perhaps we're missing some context, and that's why sometimes I think terms like anxiety and narcissism tend to get maybe overused or misused.
And I mean, I guess what is the so let's take anxiety for example. Like, what is the proper way to use it? Like, and I want to be respectful of people because, like you said, some people just like just throw that word around, but not really be clinically diagnosed. I mean, should we be more self-aware? Should we avoid using things like that? I mean, this is your specialty, so I don't know why it's bothering me more. It seems like it's bothering you, but like, what do you think about like us not using it and throwing that word around so much?
Well, I think there's a difference again between saying I felt anxious, right? Because that might have been true for you. And I think it's important that people have the language and feel free to express themselves. I do really think that's a cornerstone of healing in any context. And saying, I have anxiety, right? I mean, that's much different. And I think that saying that you have anxiety because you felt nervous before a test isn't necessarily reflective of and respectful of people who actually have a clinical mental health diagnosis and are struggling with crippling, anxiety on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and it's funny. So last season, I had a narcissism expert on, Vanessa Reiser, who wrote that narcissism book, and that was one of those words too that I think got thrown around a lot, especially
Right.
during Trump. But like this idea of a narcissist, and then speaking with her and reading up on it, like narcissism, like, and this is me again, uneducated, is equal to sociopath. Like a narcissist basically has no feelings for other people. Everyone just automatically assumes, oh, a narcissist is just someone who thinks all about themselves. Not really. I mean, it's part of it, but it's not
Exactly.
all of it,
Right.
right?
Exactly. And once again, there's a difference between having a narcissistic trait. You were totally self-centered, you were totally unempathetic in that instance, and having a narcissistic personality disorder, which is a really serious diagnosis, right? So not everybody who is arrogant or condescending or self-centered has narcissistic personality disorder. That is a loaded gun, right? And we need to
Yeah.
be careful and mindful about the language that we use.
And it was funny too during this conversation I had with Vanessa. I was like, she was ticking the boxes of what a narcissist is, and I'm like, holy shit, some of that is me. And then she gets like, and then she gets to the end where basically she's like, narcissist, like, don't give a shit about anyone else's feelings. And I'm kind of like, I'm way too empathetic. Like, I care too much what people think. So I'm like, oh, whoof, I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm like, that's great. So let's connect to high performers and narcissists because I think again we throw around language like it means nothing, but words do matter. Um, what tell us about this sort of intersection of a high performer and a narcissist?
So, it's really interesting because there have been studies done that have found an increased prevalence of personality disorders among C-level executives. Now, narcissistic personality disorder is one such diagnosis. There are others, right? Antisocial personality disorder, histrionic person, I could go on, right? But it's really interesting because there is a higher prevalence of these traditionally treatment resistant diagnoses among we'll pick on C-level executives here for a moment. And so I think this really reflects what we talked about earlier, that all of the parts that propel a peak performance really are adaptive in a lot of ways. They might, compel ambition and motivation and make you less concerned about stepping on the people around you. But perhaps they come at a cost. And in this case, the cost is one's mental health, right? And so there's duality in, one of the things I talk to my clients a lot about is that there's duality in everything. There's duality in arrogance, right? There's even duality in narcissistic tendencies, right? But we have to look at both sides. We have to understand, how are these traits serving an individual and what are they costing that individual and the people around them?
Mhm. And it's funny in the macro, I think high performers are generally seen as, I guess heroic or successful or are icons like Steve Jobs. On the macro, oh, high performer, great leader, and then you read the stories about him in the office and like, man, that guy's a freaking asshole. Insert whatever kind of like iconoclast you want in there, like whether it's Elon Musk or anyone else that are these super high performing people. They get shit done. They are at the best, 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 like the upper 1% of the 1%, yet they're also assholes. So tell us about that. Like the fact that, a high performer could also be a dick.
Right. And I'm not here to, sort of malign high performers because we need them, right? We
Yeah.
need the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks, et cetera, et cetera. We need them to drive progress and to drive us forward as a society, but we also have to recognize that sometimes that doesn't always mean that, these people are the most well-rounded human beings. And so again, I think sometimes what does it take to be a high performer? It takes an enduring work ethic. It takes sometimes an obsessive, compulsive approach to one's work, right? Sometimes it takes, and often I would say, it takes really profound sacrifice in one's personal life in terms of relationships, for example, right? It takes a business oriented approach to decision making that doesn't necessarily consider the feelings of the people around us. And so that's often what it takes to achieve these heights of success that you speak of. And again, that serves us as a society in many ways, but it could also cost, the well-being of the people around us. It can cost relationships. It can cost even a lot more than that.
And I know we live in this black and white world, but I think we all understand that there's more gray and more nuance than anything. But if we could give a more of a black and white answer here, what makes a good high performer? And I'm not saying just in terms of like monetary success, business success, whether it's stature in their community, but also like that ground level stuff we're talking about, like in terms of relationships. In your experience, what makes a healthy high performer? Because there could be some unhealthy aspects of it, but what makes a healthy one?
Yeah, totally. And I'm so glad you asked that question, Joe, because it is possible. And I think this is what so many of my clients come to me and to us as a practice to work on is I don't want to let go of my high performing ways, right? Like I'm afraid if I work with you, you're going to take away my ambition or my edge, right? So how can we approach success and peak performance in a way that is well-rounded and healthy? And it is totally possible. And that's the essence of the work that I do. And so as I mentioned earlier, I think values alignment is so very important because we know that values misalignment is a primary risk factor for burnout, right? And then burnout depletes us and it impairs performance and impairs critical thinking and decision making and all these things. So it's not necessarily workload, right? I think traditionally we think that the more somebody works, the more that they're going to burn out. And that's just not the case, right? If somebody is totally passionate about and interested in and invigorated by the work that they do, it almost doesn't matter. Work doesn't feel like work. So I think approaching work from a values aligned perspective, and that doesn't have to mean a total career overhaul, but a lot of the work that I'll do with people is identifying what are your 5 core values? What are the things that matter most to you? Is it status? Is it education? Is it financial security? Is it relationships? Is it family? And then take inventory of the way that you spend your time and your energy. Do those two align? And so finding values alignment in one's work, I think, is a critical strategy for both achieving peak performance and also avoiding burnout.
And how does a high performer separate the performer from the human being? And the reason I bring this up is like, high performers, they go on vacation, they
Yes.
have weekends, they eventually retire once they get to a certain age. And I feel like that could be a struggle for a lot of high performers of like when to turn off that switch. It's almost like to use like a Superman metaphor. It's like when are you Clark Kent and when are you Superman? How do you balance that? Is that an issue that you deal with your clients of like being
Totally.
able to turn that off?
Yeah, totally. And what you're really talking about, Joe, is intentionality and agency, right? So I talk about perfectionism a lot because I think it's just across the board a characteristic of the high performer. So let's talk about perfectionism. If I'm working with a surgeon and he's got to be in the OR, right? Or she's got to be in the OR. And especially if it's my parent or my sibling or my spouse on the table, I want them to be perfectionistic in that time, right? So perfectionism is a tool ideally that we pick up when we need it. But then say that surgeon goes home and helps their kid with their math homework, right? Let's put the perfectionism down for a minute, right? We don't necessarily need it. Or when that surgeon lays their head on the pillow at night to go to sleep, right? Let's put that tool, because it is a tool, down like any other tool. Pick it up when you need it and put it down when you don't need it anymore. or, a trial attorney. Sure, closing arguments, have high expectations for yourself, right? But when you're learning a new skill, maybe you're taking a dance class or a yoga class, be gentle. And so I think what you're talking about is developing a sense of intentionality. So choosing when to use those behaviors and those traits when they truly are adaptive, and then choosing when they're not really serving us anymore. And that is a skill.
Is that one of the hardest parts for these perfectionists slash high performers? Is the fact that obviously there's again nuance to
Yeah.
the you being a high performer, but like that ability to turn it on and off, I'm sure can be very difficult. And I wonder how that has a sort of a ripple effect or butterfly effect to the people around you, whether it is your children, whether it's your spouse, partner. Um, Tell me about how you work with your clients in terms of relationships, because you mentioned the intentionality, but again, these people are so driven that sometimes they think they're doing the right thing just because it's always always to 11, as they say in Spinal Tap. But like, tell us about those struggles for these high performers.
Yeah, so I think what's so interesting about the human psyche, and this is where I'll talk about a bit of neuroscience, is that we subconsciously seek out situations and information and experiences that reflect what's comfortable and familiar to us. Right. So if it feels comfortable and familiar to always be on 11, so to speak, to always be hustling and grinding, we are going to subconsciously seek out more and more and more of those experiences. This is our mind's way of keeping us safe, right? Because what's sort of known and familiar is probably likely safe, right? Probably a good idea. And so, what values work does, and what my work with clients hopefully does, is take them out of that subconscious programming, that default mode of operating, and really give them an opportunity to reflect upon, okay, this is what feels safe, but what do you actually want? Right? Because when we're not conscious and intentional, we don't get what we want or what we wish for. Instead, we get what subconsciously feels safe. And so it requires reflection and introspection and the identification of what really matters. And then later a choice, right? To put down that default mode programming and turn more towards something that might not feel all that familiar, might not feel all that safe, but is definitely representative of what we value and what we want.
Hmm. And if I may analyze a little here, some of the things and words you use to describe like how a high performance is, I almost feel like addiction. Like they're almost like addicted to this. Is there a level of addiction when it comes to being a high performer?
Yes, and I think just like addiction, addiction to substances, these high performer parts develop in an effort to protect us against feeling bad. So just like someone who's addicted to alcohol might reach for a drink to numb or to protect against shame or sadness or loss, somebody might reach for the hustle, the grind, right? The ambition, the perfectionism in an effort to defend against feeling less than, like in your sports analogies.
Right. I wonder, do people feel the need? And if maybe maybe there's not, but do people who are high performers like that? Does that addictive gene like stick into other things that like okay, so for me to be a high performer, I've got to drink this alcohol, I've got to take this substance, maybe it's medication. Tell us about how that works with a high performer who's I guess looking for an extra edge when it comes to being a high performer.
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is what I call an intolerance for discomfort, right? So if we learn early on how not to feel our feelings, in any way, right? And in this context, we're talking about high performer behaviors and traits. If we learn how not to feel our feelings, then we become less and less tolerant of pain and discomfort as a result. So we kind of need to ratchet up notch by notch these numbing, avoiding, distracting behaviors if it is immersing ourselves in our work. I often see kind of a syndrome, right? A cluster of behaviors that are commonplace among high performers. And it certainly includes, workaholism. It includes that hustle and grind. It might also include over exercising or over scheduling, sort of compulsive busyness, which is all reflective of this underlying intolerance for discomfort because we never developed the coping skills early on that we need to just sit with what it feels like when we get dissed by somebody at a restaurant.
Is this AB like high performer, not high performer? Like, what are the classifications? Tell me about that because I feel like I'm a lost words to like to say what someone who is not a high performer. Like, what are the levels of performance? Like, is there a mid performer? Is there a low performer? Like, what is the scale here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like most things, the high performer personality occurs on a spectrum, and I think what factors into that is variable, right? I think that really depends on what our early life experiences were, what we learned to do in order to secure praise and attention and a sense of self worth, what paid off for us as kids, how much we learned healthy coping and self-regulatory skills, right? So that we didn't necessarily need to lean into these behaviors as much. So it does really occur on a spectrum. It's not AB, it's not all or nothing. And there is a lot of variability when we talk about these personality types.
I see. So in a way, we are all high performers. It's just that it's a gradient. Like there's the from 0 to 100. It's like depending on where you're going with it. All right. So let's because some of you watching or listening and be like, okay, I don't know if I'm a high performer, but like this idea of working or living with a high performer sounds like hell. Uh, what do you say? And maybe these are not your clients, but like, what do you say to folks who have to deal with a high performer? Maybe it's at work, maybe it's even at home, maybe you have a parent or spouse. Like, what do you say to people that live with high
Yeah.
performers and work with them?
Yeah. Well, I want to answer your question, Joe, but I want to, if it's okay with you, jump back because you're right, is that high performers aren't just limited to the professional world. My definition of a high performer is anybody who diligently performs a role, a character, or a function at the expense of their own needs and often in an effort to defend against pain and shame. So that can include a C-level executive or a doctor, an attorney, or a professional sports player, but it can also include a student or even a stay-at-home mom or dad. I work with a lot of high-performing stay-at-home moms, right, who embody these traits of perfectionism and people-pleasing, for instance. And so to your point about maybe we have all got a bit of a high performer in us, and I think probably that's true, right? Because we've all got these roles and these functions that we play. Um, but to answer your question, how does one cope with, how does one navigate a relationship with a high performer? And I think the very first step in for somebody in that kind of a situation is to recognize that it's not personal, right? That this isn't a reflection of you or how much you matter or how important you are to your loved one. Really, that these high performer traits, perhaps it's hustle, grind, workaholism, etc., is really develop as coping mechanisms. Again, in an effort to protect against or defend against discomfort, pain, or shame.
Hmm. All right. Let's wrap this up by talking about the long lasting effects of this because we talked about how it's obviously helpful. Like society needs high performers, like we discussed. We talked about how high performers help motivate other people. But what are the long lasting effects of being an untreated high performer, of not maybe being cognizant of it, being aware of it? I always talk about and write about self awareness. I feel like as a society, we all suck at it. So when you're a high performer, and you're not self-aware and we talked about all these things that could happen whether it's in your relationships or work,
Yeah.
what are the long-lasting effects of not treating or being aware of being a high performer?
Yeah, Joe, I would say they are vast and not just limited to the mental health arena, but certainly I'll start with mental health. I think the long-lasting effects of unchecked, unconscious, high-performing, behaviors include burnout. And again, paradoxically, uh, sometimes a hyper focus on performance makes us vulnerable to burnout and therefore impaired performance. Right? Which is really interesting and truthfully why a lot of clients come to me in the first place. A lot of the time people are reluctant to say, I'm depressed and I need therapy. But people will say, my performance is struggling, at work and I need performance coaching. right? And so what we know is that there is this undeniable intersectionality between performance and mental health, and you can't really have one without the other. But, to your point, I think the lasting effects of unchecked high performing traits and behaviors is burnout, impaired performance. And then over the long term, we become a lot more vulnerable to some of these clinical mental health diagnoses like generalized anxiety disorder or major depression, for instance. Um, but I'll also speak to the physical health ramifications of, chronic high performer lifestyle. We know that when we are living out of alignment with our values, and we know that when our system is chronically stressed, this stresses the immune system and the nervous system and the metabolism in such a way that really does make us more vulnerable to physical illness and also mental illness. So, you mentioned self-awareness, and I think that's such an important first step for anybody who thinks that they might fall into this category.
Yeah, you know what's funny? As you're talking about this, I'm getting the picture, and I always think in movies, but of the Brooks scene from Shawshank Redemption. Remember, Brooks was in prison his entire life, and then once he got out of prison, he didn't know how to cope, and he subsequently took his life. I wonder if high performers are so linked to their career. I'm very guilty of this. Maybe it's a generational thing, but as Gen Xers, you always identify like your name and what you did for a living. What happens to a high performer when that career is either snatched, whether it's a firing or leaving a job or retirement? How do high performers cope with not being the it person, the man or woman on top?
Yeah.
What do those struggles look like?
Well, I think if said high performer is conscious and self-aware and values aligned, that's a much more seamless transition than for somebody who is not conscious and self-aware and values aligned. Because if that's the case and somebody retires or loses their job, then they've just lost their coping mechanism, right? Then they've just lost their numbing agent, and they might be confronted with all of this pain and shame and discomfort that they've been kind of avoiding and protecting against and defending against all of this time. So I agree with you. I think self-awareness is just critical in really ensuring that, somebody who is a high performer is doing so healthfully.
Hmm. And the way you do it is by helping with therapy. So if folks were listening or watching this, what's the best way to connect with you, work with you, find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. So they can reach us on our website at www.invitedoakpark.com. We also have sort of a baby social media following on Instagram that I am reinvigorating my focus on in 2025. And our handle is at invited.llc.
Awesome. Lauren, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Joe, it's been a pleasure.
And that'll do it for this episode of Good Listen. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you tap that thumbs up button on YouTube. It's a small gesture, but it really helps the channel. If you're listening or watching on Spotify or checking us out on Apple, a 5-star review would be greatly appreciated. I really, really appreciate you spending time with me. I know there's a lot of stuff out there you could be consuming right now, but just taking the time and watching this is something that I'll really share. So thank you so much for that. And if you want to connect with me, send me a note. Go to joepardavila.com. You can find my socials there. You can send me an email. All that stuff is right there at joepardavila.com. But until next time, I will see you. Adios.